The Battle of Flodden, a royal disaster in the making. How does a king known for his charm and cunning march 30,000 men to their doom? Why did Scotland's proudest moment of glory turn into its darkest disaster? And what exactly drove James IV to abandon his hilltop advantage, charging headlong into a slaughter that would leave his kingdom in ruins? The year was 1513, and King James IV of Scotland had made a decision that would echo through the ages, aligning with France against his wife's brother, Henry VIII of England. It seemed like a brilliant move on paper. The legendary Auld Alliance between Scotland and France was strong, and the English king was off conquering France. James had the perfect opportunity to strike. But what happens when pride outweighs strategy? When a hill that could have been a fortress becomes a grave? Enter the Earl of Surrey, a man running low on food, beer, and time, yet brilliantly crafty enough to outwit an army twice his size. In a brutal, bloody showdown at Flodden, swords clashed, alliances crumbled, and one of history's most disastrous royal gambles was played out in the mud. Want to know how it all went down? Stick around, because this isn't just the story of a battle, it's a royal tragedy that shaped Scotland's destiny forever. September 9, 1513. The borderlands between England and Scotland were once again the scene of bloody battle, but this time it wasn't just another skirmish. It was a catastrophic showdown between two kingdoms, culminating in the tragic and ignoble death of Scotland's King James IV, a man whose ambition, charm, and fatal miscalculations led him down a path that would forever change the course of Scottish history. But what led to this catastrophe? Let's rewind and dive into the politics, the alliances, the betrayals, and of course the ill-fated love letters that set the stage for one of the bloodiest battles Britain had ever seen. King James IV of Scotland was no ordinary monarch. He was the embodiment of charisma, a lover of the arts, a patron of science, and the man responsible for dragging Scotland kicking and screaming into the Renaissance. Born in 1473, he became king in 1488 after a tumultuous uprising, following the death of his father, James III. The young James had been raised with the weight of a troubled crown, his childhood marred by the constant threat of rebellions and political struggles that dogged the Stuart dynasty. His family tree was as tangled as the politics of the time, with alliances often forged in blood and broken by ambition. But his bloodline also connected him to his rival, King Henry VIII of England, through his marriage to Henry's sister, Margaret Tudor, a union meant to bring peace between the two kingdoms. James' marriage to Margaret in 1503 was a strategic move, aimed at calming centuries of hostilities. Unfortunately, when you mix pride and political intrigue with a family of Tudors, peace is usually the last thing on the menu. On the other side of the coin was King Henry VIII, England's infamous monarch, whose political ambitions and thirst for military glory could be traced back to his illustrious but troubled Tudor lineage. Born in 1491, Henry was the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. He was never meant to be king. His older brother Arthur had that destiny. But when Arthur died young, Henry suddenly found himself heir to the throne. A boy raised in the shadows of power suddenly had all the world's weight on his shoulders. Crowned in 1509, Henry VIII was eager to prove himself, and what better way to do that than through war? By the early 16th century, the political chessboard of Europe was a tangled mess. France, under King Louis XII, had emerged as the dominant power in Europe, primarily through its aggressive expansion into Italy. Naturally, this made everyone else nervous. To counter French dominance, the Holy League was formed, an anti-French alliance composed of Venice, Spain, the Papal States, and the Holy Roman Empire. In 1511, Henry VIII, eager for his own shot at glory, joined the League, setting the stage for a military showdown with France. But while Henry was busy plotting his invasion of France, Louis XII wasn't just sitting around waiting for disaster. He had a few tricks of his own, the most crucial being his alliance with Scotland, renewed in 1512 as part of the Auld Alliance. The Auld Alliance, a centuries-old pact between France and Scotland, was one of the longest-lasting military alliances in history. Its purpose was simple: keep England in check. If England attacked France, Scotland would invade from the north, and vice versa. So when King Louis XII called upon James to honor the alliance, the Scots were, like it or not, roped into France's war against England. What was in it for James, though? A lot more than just friendship with the French king. James saw this as a golden opportunity to expand his prestige, possibly even his territory, at England's expense. He fancied himself the hero of Scotland, and who better to humiliate Henry VIII than his own brother-in-law? Louis played James like a fiddle. Not only did he send military supplies, lances, pikes, gunpowder, and the like, to bolster the Scottish army, but he also appealed to James' romantic side. The Queen of France, Anne of Brittany, sent James a personal letter, addressing him as her knight, begging for his protection against the vile King Henry. She even enclosed a turquoise ring and sent 14 crowns to help with his war costs. James, ever the chivalrous knight, was completely smitten. Forget strategy, he now saw himself as the protector of a distressed queen. He had to invade England, if only to defend her honor. As the summer of 1513 rolled in, the atmosphere between England and Scotland was heating up. Both nations were engaged in an arms race, preparing for the inevitable clash. In Scotland, King James IV ordered the full mobilization of his army, warning Henry VIII that he would invade England unless the siege of Therouanne, a key French stronghold, was lifted. Henry's reaction? Oh, he wasn't just angry, he was apoplectic. Enraged by James's threat, he is said to have shouted, "Shall I be thus braved by him in his far corner of the world?" He knew all too well the old trick of the Scots, who liked to invade whenever the English king was away. But Henry wasn't just any English king. Before setting sail for France on June 30th, 1513, Henry ensured that he had not one, but two armies at the ready. While he led the southern army into France, he appointed the Earl of Surrey, an aging but experienced commander, to raise the second army in the north, ready to defend England from the Scottish menace. Back in Scotland, James pressed ahead, though many of his nobles were reluctant. They knew invading England was a gamble, especially with Henry away. But James was unwavering, driven by his sense of duty to the Auld Alliance, and perhaps more by his infatuation with the French queen. In the summer of 1513, while King Henry VIII was off in France, no doubt dazzling the French with his royal swagger and oversized codpieces, a far more pressing threat brewed in the north. King James IV of Scotland, convinced that this was his moment to teach the English a lesson, was preparing for war. And the timing couldn't have been worse for England, because their own king was too busy showing off his armor and questionable French skills across the Channel. Now, here's where things get interesting. Enter Thomas Howard, the 70-year-old Earl of Surrey. Surrey wasn't some noble with a fancy title. He had a family tree as tangled and sharp as a Scottish thistle. His father had fought at Bosworth Field in 1485 against none other than Henry VII, the current king's dad. That's right, Surrey's family had been on the wrong side of the Wars of the Roses. But now, decades later, Surrey was one of Henry VIII's most trusted men. Time, it seems, heals all wounds, or at least it lets you live long enough to fight someone else's battles. Surrey had clawed his way back into royal favor after his family's defeat at Bosworth and was now the king's lieutenant of the north. He had proven his mettle during the 1497 siege of Norham Castle, when he relieved the fortress from a Scottish attack. So, when King James IV came knocking on England's northern door in 1513, Surrey was the man to answer. Join us as we journey back to the dawn of history. From epic battles to pivotal moments of triumph and tragedy, we're committed to uncovering the untold stories that have defined who we are today. Each video is meticulously crafted to transport you to the heart of the action, where you'll witness the struggles, triumphs, and sacrifices of those who came before us. But we need your support to continue our mission. By subscribing to our channel, you'll become part of a community dedicated to preserving and sharing our collective heritage. Together, we'll unlock the secrets of the past and ensure that they're never forgotten. Don't miss out on our latest releases. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on our newest videos, packed with thrilling narratives, stunning visuals, and thought-provoking insights. Subscribe, follow, and embark on an unforgettable journey through history. In September 1513, James IV of Scotland did what every self-respecting monarch with delusions of grandeur would do. He called up the biggest army Scotland had ever seen, a whopping 30,000 men. Noble knights, Highland clansmen, and pikemen swarmed into his ranks. It was an impressive sight, until you remembered that most of them had never fought outside of clan squabbles and could barely understand each other, given the dialect differences. But it wasn't their fault. They were bound to serve the king for 40 days, in a feudal system dating back centuries. They had to provide their own weapons, food, and probably their own bagpipes. After all, it wasn't a Scottish army without a good bagpipe wail. James didn't just gather men, he gathered cannons, lots of them. By 1513, Scotland boasted one of the best artillery trains in Europe, courtesy of James's obsession with big guns. Unfortunately for him, having lots of cannons didn't mean you knew how to use them effectively in battle, but we'll get to that. Meanwhile, the English under Surrey had a different approach. His army was about 20,000 strong, smaller but composed of a mix of professional soldiers and militia. These men were battle-hardened, and thanks to years of fighting the French and each other, they knew their way around a battlefield. Surrey's personal retinue consisted of 599 men, mostly drawn from his estates in East Anglia. Only 43 of them were cavalry, and just one, a man named Avery of Barnet, wore full armor, looking like a tin can ready to roll down the nearest hill. But what the English lacked in heavy armor, they made up for in discipline. They also had longbows. The Scottish had seen English longbows before, back in the days of their ancestors' nightmares at Bannockburn and Falkirk. But clearly, those lessons had been forgotten, along with a lot of other strategic thinking. Surrey's army also had firepower, 5 brass field guns called serpentines and 18 smaller falcons, manned by 400 gunners, drivers, grooms, and craftsmen. And naturally, there was a man with the charmingly medieval title of Groom of the Gunpowder, probably the last person you wanted to annoy. On July 21, 1513, Surrey set off from London with his ragtag army, heading north to deal with the Scottish problem. By August 1st, he reached Doncaster and sent out letters to the northern sheriffs, ordering them to prepare their militias. Meanwhile, he had Sir William Bulmer patrol the borderlands with mounted archers, keeping an eye on the Scots. James IV was busy across the border, tearing up the countryside like a man with a score to settle. He launched raids into Northumberland, setting 7 villages on fire and driving off cattle like he was shopping at a livestock clearance sale. But his high spirits would be dampened when Sir William Bulmer ambushed Lord Home, one of James's key commanders, and his 3,000 raiders near Millfield. Home lost not only a significant number of men, but also his personal banner. A humiliating blow for any nobleman worth his tartan. But even after this setback, James wasn't done. On August 22nd, he crossed the border with his full force, prepared to bring the English to their knees. Surrey, on the other hand, had no intention of letting the Scots just waltz through Northumberland unchecked. He finally got the news he needed. James was besieging Norham Castle, the very same stronghold Surrey had saved years earlier. Surrey now had to mobilize quickly, despite his limited funds. He gathered his army and marched to Durham by August 30th, picking up reinforcements, including the banner of St. Cuthbert, a relic meant to rally the northern men like some sort of divine insurance policy. He was also joined by his son, Lord Admiral Thomas Howard, bringing 1,210 professional soldiers from the English Navy. They may have been Marines, but in a pinch, they'd do for a land battle. Back on the Scottish side, things were getting weird. According to legend, a mysterious figure appeared to James in Linlithgow, dressed in a blue gown, warning him not to go to war. This spectral visitor even claimed that James would fail if he didn't heed the advice. But, like any king with a death wish and a loaded cannon, James ignored the ominous stranger and continued his invasion plans. James may have had the numbers, but his army wasn't exactly a well-oiled machine. The Scottish system of mobilization relied on barons, freeholders, and royal borough citizens mustering their men for 40 days of military service. They had to arm and feed themselves, something that worked well for a quick raid, but not so much for a prolonged campaign. Still, James managed to capture Norham Castle after a 5-day siege, leaving the English border wide open. But rather than pressing his advantage, he dithered. This gave Surrey the time he needed to fully mobilize his forces and prepare for battle. The Battle of Flodden, September 9, 1513, was a chaotic and bloody affair, filled with tactical blunders, misguided pride, and a fair amount of sheer bad luck. To set the scene, we must rewind just a few days, to when King James IV of Scotland was happily camped on Flodden Edge, a formidable hill in northern England. His army, entrenched and perched like hawks ready to swoop, had all the advantages of height, artillery, and numbers. But despite this, James was more preoccupied with an entirely different matter: Lady Heron of Ford Castle. James, a notorious ladies' man, had a reputation for mixing business with pleasure, and this time was no different. Chronicles from the time point fingers at him for allegedly dallying with the fair Lady Heron instead of pressing the Scottish advantage and marching south. Was it love, lust, or simply poor judgment? We'll never know, but one thing was clear: James's enemies weren't standing still. While James was preoccupied, Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey, was sharpening his own tactics. On September 5th, Surrey sent a challenge via Rushk, an English herald, to King James, accusing him of invading English lands without just cause. The challenge was to settle the matter by arms, on September 9th no less. This was no ordinary message delivery, though. Rushk was expected to do some genteel spying, scoping out the Scots' defenses while pretending to wait for a royal response. But James, perhaps sensing the intrigue, detained the herald, thus preventing Surrey from getting any valuable information. In a tit-for-tat move, when James finally sent his own Scottish herald to Surrey's camp with an acceptance of the challenge, Surrey, too, detained the Scottish herald. The exchange only happened days later, leaving Surrey to realize far too late that he had committed to battle with an enemy dug into a nearly impregnable position. To make matters worse for Surrey, his army was running low on provisions. Beer had run out, and let's face it, thirsty soldiers make grumpy soldiers. Surrey knew he had to act fast or risk watching his army disband from hunger and desertion. With the Scots sitting comfortably atop Flodden Hill, refusing to descend, Surrey found himself in a strategic pickle. Storming a hilltop position was military suicide, but letting his men wither away from lack of food was equally unappealing. So, on September 8th, Surrey made a bold move. He marched his troops around the eastern flank of the Scottish position, intending to cut off James's line of communication with Scotland, essentially daring the Scots to come down and fight. It was a gamble, and Surrey knew it. If the Scots refused to budge or worse, counterattacked, his army could easily be trapped between the Scots and the River Tweed. Yet, with no other options, Surrey moved his army to Barmore Wood, just a few miles from the Scottish position. James, alerted to Surrey's maneuver, decided to act decisively. To deny the English the high ground on Braxton Hill, he ordered his men to set fire to their camp, burning straw and litter to create a smokescreen. Under this cover, James's army abandoned their stronghold on Flodden Edge and repositioned themselves on Braxton Hill, which provided a more advantageous spot. It was a crafty move, but not without risk. As the Scottish forces repositioned, Surrey's son, Lord Admiral Howard, was in the midst of moving his artillery across a swampy area. The Scots suddenly appeared on the hill above him, leaving the English force scrambling to deploy. The situation was critical, and for a moment it seemed as though defeat was staring the English in the face. Howard sent an urgent message to his father, begging him to hurry and reinforce the faltering English lines. James IV was not one to shy away from a fight, and seeing the English vanguard isolated and vulnerable, he seized his chance. With the rain-slicked grass beneath their feet, the Scottish army advanced, many of them ditching their boots to get better traction on the slippery hillside. They came down in disciplined silence, following the German-style Almain method, which meant no battle cries, just grim determination and lots of pikes. The first clash was brutal. The Scots slammed into the English right flank, rolling over them with alarming speed. The Earls of Hume and Huntly led their men into battle, and for a moment it looked like victory was within reach. But just as the Scots gained the upper hand, the English borderers under Lord Dacre appeared and drove back the Scottish attack with savage determination. The tide began to turn. King James IV, determined to fight alongside his men, dismounted from his horse and plunged into the front ranks, pike in hand. It was a stirring, heroic sight, a king fighting shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers. But there was just one problem. By putting himself on the front line, James relinquished control over his army. Any chance of commanding the battle disappeared, as he became just another soldier in the chaos of hand-to-hand combat. And chaos it was. The Scottish pikes, normally so fearsome, were rendered almost useless on the treacherous ground. The English, armed with shorter polearms called bills, cut through the disorganized Scots with lethal efficiency. The Scots, unable to keep their footing on the wet grass, stumbled and slipped as they tried to press forward. Those that lost their pikes took to their swords, but they were no match for the well-disciplined English soldiers who held their ground. James fought valiantly, striking out at the enemy, but in the confusion of battle, he lost his helmet, took an arrow to the face, and was eventually hacked down by an unknown English soldier. The King of Scotland, who had staked everything on this battle, lay dead on the field, his dreams of glory shattered. As night fell, the battlefield of Flodden was strewn with the bodies of thousands of Scottish soldiers, including much of the nation's nobility. Alongside their king, men like Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, and George Gordon, Earl of Huntly, had fallen. In all, some 10,000 Scots lay dead, an unimaginable loss for the country. Word of James's death spread quickly, and Scotland was plunged into mourning. Queen Margaret Tudor, the English-born widow of James, was left to rule a kingdom in tatters, while her infant son, James V, was crowned king at just 1 year old. The infant king would inherit a country devastated by the loss of its warriors and leaders, a kingdom crippled politically and militarily for years to come. On the other side of the border, England celebrated. Catherine of Aragon, acting as regent while Henry VIII was away, gleefully boasted of the victory, even considering sending James's blood-stained coat to her husband as a trophy. For the English, Flodden was a triumph, a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat, thanks in part to James's ill-fated decisions. The Battle of Flodden was more than just a military disaster for Scotland. It was a sobering reminder that glory often comes at a terrible price. James IV's ambition to aid France and claim victory against England led him to gamble everything, and in the end, he lost it all. The Scottish army, despite its superior numbers and tactical training, had been outmaneuvered by an English force that knew how to make the most of the terrain and its weapons. For Scotland, the battle marked the end of an era. The medieval power of the Scottish crown had been shattered, and the country would never fully recover from the loss of so many of its leaders in a single day. The infant James V would grow up in a kingdom scarred by his father's tragic defeat, a kingdom where ambition and pride had led to ruin. And so the curtain fell on one of the bloodiest battles in British history, a battle where bravery was not enough to save a king, and where the future of Scotland was written in blood. Flodden would be remembered not just as a defeat, but as a lesson in the perils of pride, poor tactics, and the fatal allure of glory. Coming up next, Battle of Solway Moss, 1542 AD. English forces defeat the Scots. How does an army of over 15,000 Scots, led by a confident king, crumble against a mere 3,000 Englishmen? What strategic blunders turned a daring invasion into an embarrassing rout that would haunt Scotland's throne forever? And why did this defeat lead to the untimely death of one of Scotland's most tragic monarchs, King James V? In 1542, Scotland and England were on the brink of war yet again. But this time, the stakes were higher. King James V of Scotland had grown tired of England's dominance, and with Henry VIII looming large to the south, he sought to strike a bold blow. With a massive force behind him, James was confident of his victory. But when the fog of war rolled over the treacherous marshlands of Solway Moss, disaster was just around the corner. Miscommunication, poor terrain, and an army that unraveled into chaos all led to one of the most humiliating defeats in Scottish history. What went so disastrously wrong for the Scots? Why did the mighty Scottish army flee from an enemy half its size? And how did this single battle contribute to the downfall of the Scottish king, setting the stage for his infant daughter Mary to inherit a throne under siege? Find out as we unravel the mystery, strategy, and misfortune behind the Battle of Solway Moss, a royal disaster that rewrote Scotland's future. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on our latest release. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next in the gripping saga of Scotland and England's turbulent past. Join us on this journey through history. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you're always the first to uncover the hidden stories behind the battles that shaped nations. Don't miss out. History is only one